Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of the War Report. I hope you all enjoyed our extended edition from last time. So, of course, just once again to clarify, there were some technical difficulties, so I had to record it on two separate nights, and then I had to edit the files together. So, we had recorded almost a full show the first night, and then recorded a full show the second night, and it was just too good to cut anything out. I couldn't bring myself to do it. So you guys got the longest episode of the War Report on record, longer than any of our year in review shows, which are always like pushing 2 hours. But we finally broke the 2 hour mark. I'm very proud of ourselves right here. Very proud of us. But we
Yeah.
have quite a bit of news to cover, and this is almost all focused on what has been happening just within the past couple of days. Just to give you a brief rundown, we
Yeah.
got a tentative agreement between Poland and Hungary. No, a tentative agreement between Poland and Ukraine. Hungary is, let's just say, acting.
It's Serbia's new best friend.
It's Serbia's new best friend. A friendship end with Poland. Serbia is my new best friend, but Hungary is. Let's just say Orban has probably reached his penultimate form when it comes to rabble rousing, which I'm very happy about. And then we also have a proposed peace plan out of Italy put forward to the UN, and some news about the sanctions, particularly countries that have been hit hard. A new study shows that Slovakia has been hit hardest. We'll get into that and a few other items going forward here. But
Hmm.
to get into just the basic updates on the ground, I know there's been some new developments even since we tried to record yesterday, because yesterday there were some scheduling conflicts, but lo and behold, here we are. So I will turn it over to you to just give us a brief update on what the hell is actually happening in Ukraine right now.
Okay. So before I begin, I just want to apologize. Not last show, but I believe the show before. I promised that I would leave a link with what South Front said about that Severodonetsk pontoon crossing.
Yes, blame him. I have nothing to do with
Uh,
post show editing. It's all him.
I literally wrote about it. Like basically, I said that uh, obviously that they were large losses on behalf of the Russians, but on closer examination, other people I cited, there were large losses also on the Ukrainians simply because there were too many like outdated BMP ones. They accounted for something like 75% of all the vehicles, and that's just not like the Russians don't use them. Um, so you're looking at Donbass and Ukrainians who use those vehicles. Anyhow, uh, so I had the wrong link to a totally different South Front article. I changed it last week. So when you press the link, you'll see that it links to the correct article. Now, all that South Front says is that there were large Russian losses, and it gives you like a little video of where this crossing was, and you can see at least one of the BMPs, but I swear there were two that in the river, some ways away. Anyhow, this I mean, it's a dead horse right now, but I just thought I'd clear that up. So there's the correct link for that. Now, to start with Ukraine and the updates. So there's been a massive push. Basically, the Popasna in the region that the Russians gained about 3 weeks ago has been actually strategically very important. That salient is rapidly expanding. It's inching towards Bakhmut, which I believe is on the way to Slavyansk. Um, now, I believe Neil Howard, the Canadian journalist, is there and reports that the Russians are just 15 kilometers away from Bakhmut. So rapid increase in speed there. And now the part of those forces now will go up north towards Slavyansk and Lysychansk. Both of those cities are now half controlled by the Russians. They're not cities. I mean, they're towns. They're big towns, but they're not cities. They're smaller than Mariupol, but they're not a village either. So there's quite a bit of progress happening in that area. It looks like that giant cauldron now is becoming two or three, at least three smaller cauldrons. But there's also some interesting news coming out of Ukraine and Donbass with regards to surrenders. Now, the Russians are saying, or at least Russian people on Telegram are saying, and some other observers, that mass surrenders by the Ukrainians are imminent. One report cited between 2 to 500 Ukrainians surrendered. Remember, the Donbass has so far the best trained fighters. NATO trained Ukrainian military for 7 years, 7.5 years, at the speed of 5 brigades per year. So many of these brigades have lost anywhere between 40 to 60% of their entire strength. So, and supplies are not coming in quickly enough. One of these brigades, the 115th Brigade, made a video where they said they refused orders to fight in Severodonetsk. That might have been instrumental why the Russians gained half of Severodonetsk so quickly. Anyhow, they made the video. However, the Rada just passed the law that says deserters. Now, I don't know if these guys are going to be considered deserters. They could be, but it up until now in Ukrainian military law, deserters could be shot, but not killed. That is, they would receive some wound, but it would not be enough to kill them. That law has been changed by saying you're allowed to shoot them. It doesn't elaborate whether they should be executed or just wounded or whatever. Now, there's been a lot of reports, really, of many of Ukrainian soldiers who have surrendered, who have said, take it how you will, right? I mean, many guys who surrender, of course, they'll say, I was the cook, I was a driver, I was just an engineer, et cetera, et cetera. But they can't all be lying all the time. And you do hear reports of guys who do want to desert and they're shot. And that wouldn't be like the first time in military history either.
No,
So that is,
it's a norm, so to speak, up until, I mean, you even had this case in World War II. Everyone knows about the Soviet case. Those are the ones that really get
yeah.
shoved in your face. But the harsh punishment of deserters is just taken as just common sense within a military sense. I mean, you could just
Mhm.
ask, go through any historical record, ask anyone who has any experience with any military, and they would just tell you that, like, well, naturally you do that. What else are you supposed to do?
Yeah. So that's what's happening in Donbass. It's a critical situation. There are reports of Ukrainian officers, higher ups, telling Zelensky that if we don't get out of Severodonetsk, we could be stuck in a cauldron. And in fact, Arestovich, who's like their PR man, has so much as said that in a recent interview. He does these regular interviews with this guy, this kind of scraggly guy. He does these video conferences with him. So I think there's credence to that story. Um, Now, I want to get to the part about the US and Europeans supplying weapons to Ukraine. I'll begin with Denmark. So, Denmark is going to supply um, Harpoon missiles that will be mounted on trucks. These not, of course, Ukraine does not have any kind of vessels left anymore
Any kind
in
of
the Black
coastline
Sea.
left?
Yeah, but these trucks will be carrying missiles, uh, air to navy, let's say, or ground to ground, that have a reach of about 240 to 250 kilometers. So it's quite the challenge. I don't know how many systems that they'll get, but they'll get at least a few trucks. These will work in tandem with other trucks that help with guidance and all of that. Like when you look at air defense systems, even if it's a simple Buk M3 or M1, they work with other trucks that have other, radar that are, they're coordinating with all kinds of information in order to take down those missiles. It's never just one piece of equipment and a truck that does all of this on its own.
Yeah, we've come a
That's
long
really
way since
how.
the 1940s. They're not jotting out on pieces of paper in order to calculate the right angle at which to fire to shoot these things out of the sky. So, or shoot them, out of the water, as it were. It's all computerized. This shouldn't surprise anyone with modernized warfare. Which, again, it will be a tough nut to crack. There were some.
Mhm.
Uh, I can't remember the name of the ship that caught on fire within the Black Sea about a month
Oh,
ago.
the Moskva.
Yes, the Moskva. You had that, so at this point, as we said, one of the first things that Ukraine lost was its navy. So the Black Sea has been more or less dominated by Russia at this point. Not that it was ever a real contest, but this
You know,
will
the
be
yeah,
and
go ahead.
this will be a thorn in the side. I don't think it'll be enough to cripple the Russian Black Sea fleet, but again, it will
No, because
be.
they have submarines.
Yes, yes, but it will be enough to again just be a significant nuisance to them. I won't even say a minor nuisance, significant nuisance in order to say. I mean, because we're talking about modern NATO country technology, and again,
Yes.
that's been a lot of what's been buoying up Ukraine ever since 2014. Of course, advisors from various NATO countries have moved in, and they have been instructing Ukrainian troops, and they have been more or less rebuilding the Ukrainian military, almost in the same way that Russia rebuilt the Syrian military, and why they have the results they did today. So, although,
Yeah.
and again, I don't buy into the worst projections about the Russian performance in the war, but the difficulties they have faced is because they're going up against, I guess we could call a quasi NATO army. Now, of course,
Yeah.
Ukraine's forces aren't advanced to say like a France or a Germany or a UK or even like a Poland or Romania, some of these other Eastern European NATO states. But it has been buoyed up for the past 8 or so years by this external funding and training. So it has proven a much tougher nut to
Yeah.
crack than one would have initially expected.
Right. So, I mean, I would say that Ukrainian training and light arms are on par with any other NATO country. Their access to really good tanks isn't the case. They have some T-72s, but they're mostly stuck with T-64s. Um, they had the best drones available, but they're no longer effective anymore. Partly, this is because the sophistication of ground-to-air defense systems are very well established right now by the Russians. They're not inside Russia while their forces logistically are trying to go on roads into Ukraine. They've taken over these territories and they've brought with them these air defense systems. And this is why the effectiveness of drones by the Ukrainians really hasn't been an issue for 6 weeks at least. And very few minor successes at all. And they've lost. I mean, I rarely even hear of a plane being shot down anymore. But that's because of those systems that are in place now. Um, the other bit of information about weapons that the U.S. is supplying to Ukraine that could make a difference is the M777 artillery gun. Now, a lot of people have spoken about this. Um, they are being taken out. So far, they have not made any kind of significant impact at all. The Russians know where they are. The Russians won't attack them when they're being moved because it's difficult to hit a moving target. However, as soon as they stop, they will hit them. And in fact, another supply depot was taken out, I believe around Zhytomyr. So this was also one of the places where barracks were taken out. And in fact, Zelensky has come out and said that the hit on Desna military barracks had killed 87 Ukrainians. Some fear it's actually much worse than that. Um, Zelensky also said that they're losing at least 100 men a day in the Donbass. And again, some people speculate it's worse than that, but that's the figure that he's willing to say. Um, Now that tech, the M777 cannon uh, that is coming over to Ukraine, up until now has not had this imaging system. It's it's a view. It's like a tablet basically, right? That's attached to the gun, but it gives them coordinates, real time coordinates. It can sense like where artillery fire is coming at for them, where they're receiving it from, but also it allows it to use a different kind of munition that has a range of 40 kilometers. This is very deadly stuff, and even Scott Ritter mentioned it in a recent video. That it's the gun with this electronic guiding system and this viewfinder that's attached to it, this video display that's attached to it, is very different than not having it. So it does make a significant difference. The Russians have artillery guns, of course. Their range is about 30 kilometers. They have a small number of other guns that have a range about 50 to 60 kilometers, but they're fewer in numbers. So, is Russia going to take these out with their like air force? Is that how they're going to handle it? Or are they going to continue to do, artillery duels, which is what they've been doing so far? Um, that's sort of that's something we should look for in the next week.
Yes, I would concur with that. That will be what we have to look forward to in the coming week on the ground in Ukraine. I believe there was some news about the fall of Lyman, which the operation was starting as we
Oh
tried to
yes,
record yesterday, and then I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, whether it be you or the chat, that it was more or less just an outright surrender. It was one of these smaller towns
yes. So
within
that town is in
well,
the Zaporozhye region.
yes, yes.
Yes, and it's called Svetlodarsk. So Svetlodarsk just gave up. Like there were no Ukrainians that fought there. And this is a region that's between Kherson and Donetsk. It has a border with the Azov Sea, and it has Zaporozhye, the city, but the space is called Zaporozhye. This is also the place where the Russians back in March took over a nuclear power plant, and they were trolling them last week, saying, if Ukraine wants energy, we'll be happy to sell them energy from the nuclear power plant.
Oh, the one that they were allegedly shelling that turned out to not be the case
Yeah,
at all.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and I believe,
like so many stories that emerge out of this war.
and I believe that that region is particularly home to one of the Cossack coasts, if I'm not mistaken. So,
I think so. There was a group of Cossacks called Zaporozhye.
yeah. Now I don't know which one was named after which, but just a little factoid for you. But with the on the ground news in Ukraine covered, we can get into let's just say
Oh,
Duda's. Oh,
sorry
what, you have more?
if I just
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry if I just may interrupt. Did I mention? I've lost track. Did I mention that Liman and Severodonetsk are already half conquered? I think I did. Yeah.
Yes, I think
Yes.
that was actually mentioned like even the last episode. But at
Well,
least,
no, they were on the outskirts. So
yeah,
now they've gone into the center of the city. That's where the fighting is. After these two towns fall, then it's Slavyansk and Bakhmut. That's it. Those are all the major towns left in Donbass and Lugansk.
I mean,
After that, it's Zaporozhye.
Slavyansk is going to be just moving forward. Just taking a look at the next few weeks here, that's going to be a major morale boost because if I recall correctly, in 2014 during the initial push by the Donbass forces, that's
Yeah.
when the tide really started to turn against them, and where the lines really started to stagnate
Yep.
until this recent Russian military operation, until the outbreak of Russian troops actually entering into Ukraine proper. But yeah, if they can take that, and especially if it is like some of these other ones where it just falls with little to no resistance, that's going to be a huge morale boost, especially for the Donbass forces, because it'll be the reverse of fortunes over the past 8 years, because that is when their advance was halted, at least on
Yep.
that front.
That's right. It's an important city, and I would say even Odessa, especially what happened in Odessa, they would now will they take Odessa? Will they even try? I don't know. Nikolaev is getting bombarded right now as we speak. Well, it's being shelled. I wouldn't say it's bombarded. Um, so I would say these are all tentative. I think what they're going to focus on is on the Donbass. My guess is they're going to go for Zaporozhye capital, and then we'll see what happens.
And not to get too ahead of ourselves, since I almost got into the Polish news, but just to cover a few things first. So you have the Davos meeting of the World
Yeah,
Economic Forum going on right now, which is very interesting. We all know that Klaus Schwab has been a villain of the right wing, rightly so, I will say. I don't think he's unfairly portrayed by most right wingers. I'll put that. No sympathy for the guy. I'll just put it that way. That has been going on, so pretty much anyone who's anyone is there. You have Duda there, of course, President of Poland, who is about to sell his big proposal for his agreement with Ukraine, which I'll get into in a few minutes. But you had Henry Kissinger there, and
yeah,
Kissinger was advising Western leaders that they should facilitate Ukraine to accept some sort of tentative peace agreement, and that the destruction of Russia is not worth the strain it would put on the West. So you have Kissinger, who is this probably, at least as far as the elites are concerned, the most respected foreign policy talking head alive right now. I know,
it's like
like,
98 or something.
I think 99 even, like he's pushing 100. I mean, it was up there with him and Brzezinski when it came to like the two definitive voices on American foreign policy. Of course, Brzezinski's been dead for about 5 years now. I mean, could you imagine Brzezinski would have lived to see this world? Like, I think
Yeah,
I think it would have made him drop dead. Maybe that's why maybe he was spared from seeing his worst dreams come true. But with Brzezinski aside, you have Kissinger, who is a realist. Look, Kissinger does have his nasty record. I'm not going to defend that. But compared to the Bush era neoconservatives and all the other foreign policy hawks afterwards, and even the Clinton era foreign policy hawks, he is a very measured voice when it comes to the West. He's a very, uh, let's just say, level headed approach when it comes to a lot of these things. And he's outright telling the West that you're not going to win an expansive proxy war against Russia, and it's not worth the strain even if you could. And it's time to more. I mean, we also have to keep in mind that Kissinger's record as Nixon's both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under each one oversaw détente with both China and the Soviet Union. So Kissinger, while he does have a lot of blood on his hands for what he did in Southeast Asia, isn't a hawk in the same way a lot of these other people are. Even though they still view him as this like respected sage when it comes to his voice and his statements are unquestionable on these sort of things, and he's outright telling them what they don't want to hear. So I thought that was just interesting to mention, just for starters.
oh yeah, definitely. He's careful how he couched that message because really he was the only person who said anything like that with regards to the war in Ukraine. He was the only realist talking there, right? He gave it like 3 months. He felt like if a peace deal is not arrived at in 3 months, this would be a catastrophe. Um, I think personally the reason why he's saying 3 months is by then Donbass will be, it's over. And I think he's afraid of Russia taking more gains, that the sanctions are not working, and that a possibly larger war could ensue. And he looks at that as a catastrophe for Europe. It would be a catastrophe for the West, definitely, if that would happen. Um, Now, I mentioned that that he was sort of the lone voice. If you bring up somebody like Joe Manchin, he's basically saying no treaty, none whatsoever. Uh, regime change in Russia, all territory seized by Russia returned to Ukraine. Until that happens, this war never ends, etc. But I'll let you talk more about Duda.
And just one last thing I'd say about Kissinger. You said he was the lone voice there. I will clarify. Really, there is nobody else in the world who could get up in front of that group of people and say that,
Yes,
and even have it be considered, and even have it be
that's right.
discussed.
Great
Because
point.
anyone else who is not Henry Kissinger would be booed off the stage, because nobody else has the credentials that they would look for. I mean, again, he is one of their, if we want to talk in religious terms, he's one of their high priests. He's one of those people
Yeah.
whose word you do not go against unless you have damn good reason to. And this, not even this pushed them to that point. There were some murmurs of discontent, but nobody outright said,
Yes.
Mr. Kissinger, you are wrong, you need to recant that statement, because nobody would dare to say that in that group of people. But with Duda, as you remarked off the show, his eyes were practically gleaming with excitement and just, he was overjoyed about this prospect that he's about to go sell to all these global elites regarding Poland and Ukraine. So this is all within the context of these are the same people who have been sanctioning and castigating his nations for its position on its religious values, on its culture, on its approach to things like the LGBTQIA issues, abortion, etc. And he's about to go kiss their ring, kiss their feet. I won't say what else he's going to kiss, but um, to sell this proposal that there should be an integration between Poland and Ukraine that allow the crossing of borders when it comes to things like law enforcement, military, commerce. I mean, particularly law enforcement and military is what we have to look at here, where Polish officials and Polish military and Polish police can operate within Ukrainian territory and vice versa. Where then you also have within the Ukrainian Rada, there would be certain privileges given to Poland, and vice versa with the Polish parliament. You'd have certain privileges given to Ukraine. So it would be what you would expect of two countries that would be looking to integrate. We discussed this possibility that was thrown out there of a outright union treaty between the two that would have them become one country. Now, we wrote that off as fantasy, and at this point, I would say it largely is. But Duda and it seemingly like the Polish elite are determined to make this happen, and they're really willing to sell this idea to the West. And of course, this is all tied into the greater Intermarium project, which Poland has been yammering on about for years. This coalition of Central and Eastern European nations as this new power bloc against Russia. Now, that may be stymied by some of Hungary's statements, Slovakia. I doubt even some of these Baltic states, like a Croatia or even a Romania at this point, would be too eager to go along with it. So pretty much it's Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. I mean, it's more or less just the former borders of the Commonwealth that they want to try to reunite with this. But they get into that, and Duda is just over the moon. Now, of course, his big sell is like, hey, look, we can have NATO forces operating legitimately in Ukraine within striking distance of Russia. So all it takes is one Russian blunder, and you have your Article 5 situation. That's what you really want. That's his big sell. At least that's what I anticipate his big sell is going to be. That, like, look, we can set this up as a tripwire. And of course, it is red meat to a lot of the Polish base. Now, I would say it's probably, if we have any Polish listeners at this rate, I might be a little surprised if we do, considering some of our opinions on certain things. But I know we at least, I think we have a few I can actually think of off the top of my head, and or listeners who have been to Poland or have a bit more of an on the ground view here. I would imagine if I just had to make a diagnosis that there are some Poles who are very supportive of this from an irredentist standpoint, like we can operate on territory that used to be ours, that used to be occupied by our people. And then I imagine, conversely, there are Poles who are very against this for that exact reason. Well, this is just going to open up the gates to more Ukrainians in Poland proper. And we've seen this. We've seen some of the problems that have resulted from the influx of refugees into Poland. You had some. I believe there was a Ukrainian killed in just a just like a bar fight because he harassed some Polish woman. That is what it ended up being. There was a case I saw today, and again, like these are a lot of like minor things, but I mean they start to add up. Look at some of the refugee crises in the West. I mean, look at like something like a London or Paris, where those things will eventually start to add up. But the case I saw today was there was a Ukrainian woman who said that because she's a Ukrainian refugee, she shouldn't have to pay for public transportation, that her passport should be enough. So you're already getting this tension building within Poland itself, and now they want to more or less open up the border between the countries and give them jurisdiction over each other. And we discussed this a little bit off air just in the past few days that there are factions within Ukraine. So there's the very pro-Russia faction, which is mainly concentrated in the east, no surprise. You have the central Ukrainian nationalists who some are sympathetic to Russia, but these are like the pro-Zelensky. This is like Zelensky's core supporters, the people who want
Yes.
like an independent, strong-standing Ukraine. Then you have the people who are more positive towards Poland and Western Slavic countries and even Western countries out of Galicia, which ironically enough is the heart of the original Bandera movement. That's where the Ukrainian nationalist movement was in the 40s when you had Bandera waging an ethnic conflict against the Polish and Jewish populations of Galicia, which some would say, and I would say, that although it seems like for the time being, a lot of those Western Ukrainians have been pacified, and in fact have been brought around to having a positive view of Poland. Number one, that could change when you actually have Polish boots on Ukrainian soil on land that used to be Poland. And also, you could have a backlash from the central Ukrainians, the pro Zelensky people, over Polish troops in land that used to belong to Poland, starting to fear irredentist ambitions from Poland. And I would I would honestly predict, and this may sound a bit drastic, I know we've talked about this before, that what I think is their last ditch plan is of the West is to try to stoke up internal conflicts within Eastern Europe to keep it internally divided, similar to how they had approached the Middle East for at least the past 30 years, if not longer, but just the past 30 years in general. That their goal is to stoke up those kind of conflicts in Eastern Europe. So I feel pretty confident in saying if this goes through, you will see a market uptick in Polish on Ukrainian and Ukrainian on Polish violence and vice versa, where a lot of Ukrainians will not be satisfied with the presence of Polish troops on their soil. And that's not just your average everyday Ukrainian or the Ukrainians who have to live in the areas that where Polish troops operate. I mean, it could be Ukrainians of significant power, politicians, figures in the military. I mean, even if you just get, uh, one squadron of Ukrainian troops patrolling the same area as Polish troops, I mean, if ethnic tensions pick up, if there's some incident or Polish cops and Ukrainian cops within the same city, and if there's one ethnic incident, you could have them opening fire on each other. This may all sound a bit drastic. I'm not saying this is going to happen anytime soon, but I think if this policy is seriously pursued, it is an inevitability that Ukrainians and Poles will trade blows, even not just on a civilian level, but I'm talking even on a law enforcement or military level.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the reasons why we said it would be. It's a bit of a fantasy because, okay, short term, yes, it could work because of the situation that Ukraine is in right now. So Ukrainians could look at this as uh, the Poles are liberating them from the orcs, right? I'm sure it'll be couched that way in common parlance. I'm sure they're going to use um, those terms.
And of course, invocation to the wing hussars. Look, we're saving Europe once again from an
Yeah,
Asiatic menace, like how we did, Vienna
in Vienna,
in I think it was what was that
1685 or
yeah
something,
I thought it was like
75.
1660 something, but I think it was like 1661. Correct me if I'm wrong. But point being is in the 1660s and in the 2020s, we're defending Kiev against the same menace.
Right, right, right. So yeah, they've always prided themselves on on that bit of history. But
And then, of course, they can take that back to the European Union and say, "Look, we're the last bulwark of defense against, Eastern totalitarianism, and you must give us more for that."
right, and like there have been rumors that in central Ukraine, there are apparently 2 battalions there now. Russia published some figures way back in late March about how many foreign nationals from various groups, from various countries that they suspect are operating with the Ukrainians in Ukraine. And by far, the largest number that they allocated was to Poles. About 1,700 volunteers is what they estimated, right? That's a huge number. Now, considering how many Ukrainians have already surrendered and died, um, I don't see that many polls. I've seen, 2 or 3 maybe, but nothing that would reflect 1,700. So either they're in the Kiev region or somewhere in the central or western region of Ukraine, and there's only a very few that are in the east. Now, I've heard one report from a Ukrainian who surrendered, who said that part of their command was made up of Poles and Azov guys who were, essentially mean to them, um, and who were disrespectful for them. And when it looked like uh, they might lose the village that they were holding, this upper command of Poles would leave. So that's like I say, take it how you will. That's a video I saw of one of the Ukrainians who had surrendered. This was about a week and a half ago. But I guess what I'd like to delve into is which groupings would have a problem over a prolonged period of polls in Ukraine, because there is no way that Ukrainians are going to be able to enforce laws in Poland. Poland would never tolerate that. On paper, yes, it looks like it's mutual and it's an equal exchange of powers and so on. Definitely, I could see that work in Parliament, perhaps, but law enforcement, this is a one-way street. I would say that Ukraine is very much the junior partner in this. And the reason this is happening is because the war isn't going well for Ukraine. Otherwise, they would not have to take this drastic step. But to get into the factions, like way back when I was watching Vice and, the war was going on in 2014 and 2015 in a heated way, you notice that, there were Russians who were like inside like some of these battalions fighting against other Russians in the Donbass, right? And from what I understand, it's these guys because they have Russian surnames. They're not Ukrainian surnames. Now, of course, yes. I mean, I know in my own country, there are a lot of Macedonians from the north who have Serbian last names because, well, I mean, this goes way back, but Serbian kings used to be crowned in Skopje, Macedonia, at one point. However, in more recent times, they move down there, they marry a Macedonian woman, and the name goes on, right? So that will account for some of them, but many of the Russian nationalists uh, who felt that they had no home in Russia for one reason or another went to Ukraine, and they're willing to like literally fight and kill other Russians over this. I would say that this group is the group that, in many ways, um, would be the most pragmatic, but also would have probably the least amount of tolerance for prolonged Polish presence in Ukraine. And the reason I say that is a lot of Western Ukrainians, of course, have gone to fight, but they've always complained that conscription and fighting should only be like within whichever region the soldier originates from. And They shouldn't have to be sent to the front lines in the east. Now, that is happening because, as I said earlier, uh, the amount of well-trained, seasoned troops are being rapidly depleted, and conscripts are having to go in and fill in the gaps on the front line. Um, a lot of the younger West Ukrainians, I know they have like Bandera statues there. I mean, they have them, I believe, in Kiev as well, but there's more of them in West Ukraine. And this might sound counterintuitive, but younger Ukrainians, I feel, from Western Ukraine would want they've wanted the integration with the EU for so long. And of course, many who fled as soon as the war started, um, they're not coming back, and they're not coming back because this is the fastest way that they can be within the EU if they can't do that within their own country. And so I would say maybe somebody who's middle aged in West Ukraine might have more difficulty with the Poles being there. The Poles will have difficulty, I think, looking at Bandera statues, to be quite honest, and them being celebrated. This is why we both said a few weeks ago that long term we can't see this working. But I would say the the people around Zelensky would be the ones who I would suspect would have the least amount of patience for this dragging on for a longer period of time. Primarily because a lot of people in Western Ukraine will openly say, "Oh, we're much more like the Poles," and they also speak a kind of Ukrainian that they consider is the actual Ukrainian. Right? For a long time in Ukrainian nationalism, it was understood that the Ukrainian spoken in Galicia is pure Ukrainian. It's not like the Ukrainian spoken in central Ukraine and parts of eastern Ukraine. That's a mix with the Russian. It's not, it's not authentic. So I would say the groups seem to be divided this way based on age and region that they come
Yeah,
from.
and one thing you also have to consider about Galicia, and this may sound like a bit of a tangent, but I promise you it's not. Just within the past century, so just from, let's just say, 1922 to 2022, or even going back a few years, let's say 1917, 1918, started the Bolshevik Revolution, Russian Revolution, whatever. During, and let's go back to even to 1914, outbreak of World War One. Now, when a lot of these Galician parts were occupied either by, mostly Austria is where they were, it was a battleground between more pro-Westerners, as it would be called, and Russophiles. There was a massive Russophile movement within Galicia. And even after the end of
Mm-hmm.
World War One, you had the West Ukrainian People's Republic, whose goal during the broader theater of the Russian Civil War was a unification with White Russia, with the white movement in Russia.
Yes.
And then you had the formation of the Soviet Union, Lenin, Stalin, and they promote Ukrainianization within the Ukrainian SSR, again promoting that pure Galician Ukrainian. You have a bit of a reverse with that in the 30s and 40s, especially after World War II breaks out and it reaches the Soviet Union. Then you have, after World War II, the deportation of, I'm sure you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Poles to Siberia to clean out the area for Ukrainians. So, in terms of, let's just say, ethnic and civilizational loyalties, just over the course of the past century and some change, it has been a very hotly contested area. Now, you will see a few cases which are more or less entertaining, and certainly the minority, of the odd Galician Russophile, but again, they are very few and very far
Yeah.
between. But again, this is an area historically, again, just looking at the past century, of people with very fickle loyalties, and that can change very quickly. Since, of course,
Mm-hmm.
we were just discussing the whole Bandera thing, and now you have the younger generations of Ukrainians, the ones who may not remember the Soviet Union, remember the tail end of the Soviet Union, who are much more pro-Polish and pro-Western. So you
Yes.
have yet another shift occurring, and again, I'm not saying this is unique to Galicia out of any other place in the world, but just looking at this particular area in this particular context, in terms of its loyalties, and you could even compare it to neighboring regions, and I'm not saying that the past century has done much to instill long-lasting loyalties among anyone really. But it just this is a particularly hotly contested one. Just looking at the recent history of the region, and the
Mhm.
fact that they would flip to be more Polish wouldn't be a surprise. Now, maybe after Polish troops arrive, especially when you get to that those people, they that age class, they'll be much more uncomfortable with Polish troops in that region. But I still think that the main pushback of a Polish presence in Ukraine is, you are right, from that central Ukrainian crowd that is most likely to be pro Zelensky, that they will be the ones who actually embrace the Banderist spirit when it comes to Poles. And I can see this already turning into a disaster. I don't know how serious Duda is about this. He seems pretty serious about it. But out of everyone, I mean, there has to be people within the Polish government and the Polish elite who know that this is what the result is going to be. And there are certainly Ukrainians who know that this is what the result is going to be, and that this is fundamentally untenable. And really, this trap they're trying to set for Russia is going to be yet again another conflict within the Europe that has never been more unified.
Hmm. Well, to add to that, and I agree with everything you said, there was a poll that I think is particularly salient, and that is about comparing how well Bandera is received as a positive figure in Ukraine from 2014 to, I believe, 2020 or 2021. And so he went from, like, honestly, like 30% acceptance to something like 65 or 70. So, like, there's this kind of cult of Bandera that is far more popular. And you can kind of look at that as a litmus test of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian identity. And so, ironically, this kind of cultish figure from Galicia is gaining more and more, let's say, symbolic power within the Ukrainian understanding of nationality and nationalism. Um, but it could be that the people from whom this idea more or less originates are the people who would be most anxious to have, like, a calm Ukraine that's integrated into the EU. But I think Central Ukrainian, which wasn't, I think, necessarily the case in 2014. I will say this, that the Atlantic Council had these kind of projections and these kinds of studies that they revealed back in the summer of 2021. And I will concede that I think they were right. But it's this central part of Ukraine that I think looks at itself as, wants itself to be more independent, and independent of Poland as well. And so they've accepted Bandera, but it's more substantive. It isn't just something historical. Um, Now, how can I put this? Um, Again, where this goes, it, because the Poles are, the Poles and the Ukrainians are bound basically by their hate for the Russians and a kind of revenge fantasy for the Russians. But you take that away, and there isn't really much that binds them at all. Ukrainians in Poland for decades have, like, more lowly jobs. They're not well regarded in Poland. Poles tend to look at them as, frankly, kind of like orcs, but
Yeah, I mean they're the
better
class of
orcs than the
migrant
Russians.
laborers. So they're
Yeah,
not going to be. I mean, it's probably how most Western Europeans would look at, say, Romanians, or if you want even a more American example, say how a lot of Americans, barring any authority breathing down their neck, probably feel about a large influx of Hispanics into the country.
yeah. So, I mean, these are kind of, xenophobic and, untoward ideas that are common, and frankly, they never go away in just about any country, especially like in Europe, where I think national identity is so important, much more so than say in North America or America in particular.
Yeah, we're talking about centuries-long ethnic feuds where, again, you can get into the history of North America. I'm not saying that those don't exist, but comparing the relationship of Anglo America to Hispanic Central America isn't the same as, again, some of these deep-seated centuries-long ethnic conflicts of this territory going back and forth, and national heroes uh, taking that territory for one country or another and falling in battle. And again, it's such a rich and deep history, and at least in that particular context, I would say that largely does not exist in North America.
Right. And I would say that most of this kind of thinking emanates from America proper, right? Like in America, the reason I think ideas about you can be a man or a woman or whatever you want is because like nobody cares who you are. Like that belief, that idea was very central in America for different reasons. Nobody thought it would get to this, right? But um, it frankly has a very different kind of, let's say, civilizational mythology. It's not that it is not like that in Europe. It is only like that in Europe because there is so much more American influence. As the way America supplies the frame as to how you view the world and your own history. And I mean that's the whole Global Homo project, is to ensure that that happens globally, not just in America. And that's not there in Eastern Europe. Like many Eastern European countries, they're playing games. They're trying to stave off like this complete change that has kind of really taken root in the UK and France and Germany, Sweden, for instance. By in doing so, they get certain perks to, as you say, to settle ancient disputes, and with irredentist projections about how how the future should be for this or that country.
Yeah, it's an exclusive right. We've talked about this time and time again. Being the bulwark against Russia has granted certain leniencies to countries like Poland and like the Baltic states, where again, there's a reason in Lithuania where you can still put on the Stahlhelm and do a little SS parade and nobody says anything,
That's right.
because they are again that bulwark, at least even from just a PR standpoint against Russia. So they're allowed to get away with that. Now, I think they know as well as we do, the minute that perpetual Russian threat disappears, that they will be next on the chopping block, that it will be them
Mhm.
who falls under that. So it does put them in a situation where I am somewhat sympathetic, because I mean, let's be honest, not that I would decry another Russian domination of Eastern Europe. I wouldn't care too much. But again, if the Baltic states were to somehow be reintegrated back into Russia, you probably wouldn't have those. You almost certainly wouldn't have those little SS parades there. Or again, if parts of Poland, and I certainly don't think that one's going to happen, would be integrated back into Russia, there would be a clamping down, maybe not entirely, but a significant degree of clamping down on Polish identity or on Ukrainian identity or whatever. That's just what hegemonic powers do. They enforce a hegemony so they can control it. That's just how it works, and you can see the American Empire doing the same thing. So they're stuck where they could be under that Russian domination, or they can perpetuate the so-called Russian threat. And again, I don't think Russia's going to steamroll over Eastern Europe anytime soon, but I'm just talking from their perspective. So they could imagine about a Russian domination of Eastern Europe, or they could play that up and appeal to the West and say, look, if we fall, you will fall. But I will once again return to Hungary, where I think if you can play these powers against each other, if you can pivot back and forth, that's really the best chance you have. And I think that countries like the Baltic states, like Poland, are far too deep into whatever the hell this is in order to
Yeah.
take the Hungarian or the Polish route. So, I mean,
I mean,
I think that's their ultimate undoing in that sense. But point being is, like, from their point of view, they're stuck in this rock in this hard place, and you hear this a lot of rhetoric from them, from these hardcore nationalists, like, we don't want the West either, but we certainly don't want Russia. So where they get stuck in this very strange position where they have to constantly argue against, like, Russia, but from the framework of also not being pro-Western, it just creates this very weird narrative within those countries.
right. And you can see the dynamic. People are kind of like some people, normies are going to be surprised about Azov and, in a country like Ukraine, given its leadership, given its recent pride in pride parades, um, they're going to look at them as contradictions because they're going to say, well, if that were the case in France or America or the UK or I don't know, New Zealand, those would be glaring contradictions. But you can see that in a way, by letting them parade their World War II glory because of a kind of an ethnic hatred for Russians, and I never say that all of that is unfounded, but you can see why that's like in a way that lulls them into believing all kinds of things are possible. So while their culture is being slowly eroded, they hang on to these um, pieces from the past that they can celebrate. And while it is a contradiction, it gives them hope that they will outlast Global Homo some way. They'll draw the energy from Global Homo. It will strengthen them, and at a opportune time when Global Homo won't be strong enough, they will be strong enough to contain Russia.
Yeah,
That
I've
that
talked to some of these
that's the
people, and
long-term
that's like
projection that they see. What's
that's
that?
I've talked to some of these people, as I'm sure you've probably talked to even more of them. That is their long-term plan. That, like,
Yeah.
we can outlast them both. We just need to, hold strong, take all that Western funds and arms, and once we outlast Russia and defeat Russia, the West will have collapsed in on itself, and we'll be the last one standing. Like, I mean, that's what these people believe, and honestly, I can't really fault them for believing it because, I mean, it isn't within their national interests for that to happen,
Yeah,
but
but that's
just
emotional
yeah,
thinking.
but just
Like
objectively, it's
defeating
not
Russia
going to
won't
happen.
make
Like,
America defeating Russia won't make America stronger because you'll die for America to do that.
yeah,
America's not going to
yeah,
do
that's
that.
that's exactly what I'm getting at. Where it's like, while that is the most optimistic projection, that's what they want to happen. I mean, they're signing up for what is fundamentally a really bad deal, and I'll get into Hungary in a minute because I keep teasing this. But, like, once again, when you have the Hungarian model or even Turkish model, now of course somebody like Erdogan in Turkey have a lot more room to negotiate with these sort of things. But again, it shows that you can really put yourself in between these two to the point where neither one will be too overtly aggressive towards you. And now you see, as the West is clamping down, they're tolerating less and less dissent. But say pre-invasion, especially, you saw this from Hungary, where they were able to really keep it one or another. And even throughout the course of this war, Hungary has, for example, supporting Finnish and Swedish NATO membership, and then opposing the sanctions package, and just this real ping-ponging back and forth. But again, we've discussed the pros and cons of the Polish and Hungarian models before, so actually getting into Hungary itself, their response to all of this is Orban has extended his emergency powers, which he originally received because of the COVID crisis, due to the state of the Ukrainian war, and has said outright, now this may sound contradictory, but he is seizing these powers to make sure, by any means necessary, that Hungary avoids getting drawn into this conflict for the
Mhm.
security and safety of the Hungarian economy and the Hungarian people and families. Those were a paraphrasing of his words that he put out there. Now, of course, this is following, as we said, the rejection, at least by Hungary, of that European Union sanctions package. And it does seem that they are determined not to get involved in this war. Now, to paraphrase one of the people from the panel on the academic agent stream today, it would be quite the situation if Hungary does do this and there's some spillover that results in a conflict between Hungary and Ukraine, where
Mm.
NATO would be contractually obligated to defend the Hungarian side, one being a NATO member, the other one not being. Now, I don't know the likelihood of something like that happening. Now, of course, spillover is always possible, but in terms of the conditions that would have to be met in order for Article 5 to be triggered with such a deliberate attack, I doubt the Ukrainians are going to get that desperate and, again, roll their tanks into Hungary, especially with all that war going on in the east. Now, there was some fear of that with Transnistria, that Ukraine would launch a preemptive strike on them and try to take out that region in Moldova that's controlled by pro-Russian separatists, but that never came to fruition. But point being, it does show that Hungary, which is one of these frontier nations of NATO for the time being, is completely uncooperative. Now, it's funny because you actually notice a bit of a north-south divide. That the further you get down south in that frontier, the less passionate they are about NATO. For example, like you have the Baltic states, which are, I would say, are more jingoistic than the Poles. Then you have the Poles. Then you get down into Slovakia and Hungary, which are again a bit on the fence and more the weary of intervention. And then you go down to uh, Romania and
Croatia.
the Balkan states, and they're more or less hands off about this. Now there are some exceptions when it comes to some voices in Romania, but in terms of the people who actually run Romania, they're nowhere near as gung ho about this as say the Balts or the Poles. So you do have this fracturing of it, and you said Croatia, where as we've been discussing, Croatia has been very hesitant to take a strong role in this conflict. As we said at the beginning of the show, with the current agreements going on, Orban has said, friendship with Poland over, Serbia is my new best friend now. And you've seen this over the past 2 years where
Yeah.
the close uh, brotherly relationship, you could almost say, with Poland that they've had has been drifting away.
Yeah.
And that has been gradually replaced by a fruitful partnership with Serbia, with particularly between Vucic and Orban. They have been very, let's just say, cordial toward each other, and
Hmm.
have really pursued a new path that you wouldn't have really expected. Now, Hungary isn't historically, at least, that anti-Serbian. Now, they certainly weren't pro-Serbian, but you will recall, and as we pointed out before, during the NATO intervention into Yugoslavia, Hungary, which was actually under Orban's government at the time, his very first time in office, did not want to be a base of NATO operations for anything going on in Yugoslavia. They didn't want to spill over. And once again, you had that same philosophy being applied by Orban in relation to Ukraine, that they don't want this to spill over and they don't want Hungarians to have to suffer and die for what is ostensibly a foreign conflict to them. And it looks like Orban is strictly determined for this, and this is on top of, as I said at the beginning of the show, a study coming out showing that Slovakia, out of all countries, has been the most negatively impacted by sanctions coming out of the European Union meant to punish Russia. Now, of course, I believe the ruble is up to, what was it?
It's at 2000 June 2015 levels right now.
Yes.
It has become so strong that Russia now is buying foreign currencies, which apparently it's not supposed to. This could cause trouble later on. But they are buying foreign currencies in order to devalue the ruble at this point. That's the kind of cash that they're swimming in right now.
So, just to quote this article from uh, your EuraCTIV.com, and if I do remember, I am a bit fickle about these things. I'll put the link, but just to quote directly from it, Slovakia for 2022 is expected to grow 2.3% according to the Commission's forecast, the European Commission's forecast, released on May 19th. However, this forecast is down from the February 5% growth, which represents the biggest revision in the entire European Union. You had conversely the Czech Republic, Latvia, and Estonia and Germany. They also saw a 2% forecast in their growth, but Slovakia's prospects have been overshadowed by the effect of Russian military aggression, which caused a strong supply shock, the European Commission has said. The sharp rise in energy and commodity prices is expected to raise production costs and reduce household purchasing powers and will slow down growth, added. So you have on top of that, again, Slovakia, one of the other core V4 nations, has suffered. Now, again, they're still expected to have economic growth, but in terms of their economic growth has been cut by more than half, from
Hmm.
5% to 2.3%. It's been cut more than half at that point. And of course, that's due a lot to energy and commodities, as was quoted by the European Commission with that. And you have Poland, who is very, once again, jingoistic about this conflict, very eager to get involved, it seems. You have the Czech Republic, who has certainly not been, let's say, the same way Hungary or Slovakia have been, where the Czech Republic was actually one of the first countries to implement laws to punish people who were spreading, quote, Russian disinformation in regard to the conflict. I'm sure you'll remember that towards the beginning of the month of the war. Now, I'm not sure if anyone has actually been prosecuted on those laws yet, but time will tell. But then the other half of the V4, as we said, Slovakia and Hungary, are much more hesitant, even for their own personal interests, to go along with this conflict because it's caused an economic such a negative economic situation
Yeah.
within their own borders. And again, that was 3 months ago. Just the quarterly projections for May. I mean, once we get to the quarterly projections for the third quarter, which I believe will probably come out around August, but from the European Commission. But
Or maybe September.
yeah, August, September, late summer, beginning of fall, around there. I mean, you could imagine that dropping down to 1%, below 1%, or even into uh, shrinking the economy at that point. So I,
Yeah, I mean, they're very worried about this oil embargo. It hasn't happened yet. Um, there's still disagreement on it, but they look at it as a catastrophe. Um, the One of the CEOs for BMW, um, in fact, said that you know we consume 37% of all natural gas in Germany just for the production of BMWs.
yeah, that
So,
will have global implication. I mean, when it comes to the auto industry. But with all that being said, you also had Orban's comments that we covered last show, talking about using Croatian ports to bring in oil
mhm.
and other goods. So I don't know if Croatia has the let's just say the infrastructure in
I
order
think
to.
Croatia is willing to play ball.
I mean,
I really do.
yeah, I think Croatia is fully on board, but in terms of the actual infrastructure they have to bring in oil
Yeah.
via sea, I don't know if they have that. But point being is they certainly have ports to bring in other commodities via sea travel. But point being is you have this growing loose coalition between Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia, where as you had the V4 nations before, the Visegrad group with Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, you're seeing Hungary start to partner more with nations uh, to its south in the Balkans, such as Croatia and Serbia, which I imagine that cooperation would grow into other Balkan nations as well, of course, Slovakia, which is just to the north of it. So you do have all of that going on right now, where it seems like Hungary has broken from that what was supposed to be the next great power bloc in Europe and decided to form its own. Because I mean, let's be honest, the Visegrad project was always dominated by Poland. Of course, Orban was the probably the most powerful political figure in there in terms of just personality and internal political strength. But once again, I can only reference that meme. Serbia is now my best friend, where it has been shown to be an objectively better deal for Hungary, I would say, in order to hitch its wagon to these other countries than to Poland, which will more likely inevitably get dragged into some sort of conflict or misery one way or another with the direction that it's going. And once again, as we discussed previously, uh, out towards the beginning of the war, Serbia was used as a way to circumvent Russian travel restrictions, where planes from Russia to Europe would, of course, stop over in Serbia because Serbia, of course, has not gone along with the sanctions package, and planes
Mhm.
from Europe to Russia, once again stop over in Serbia. And we speculated that Serbia, with that status, would likely be a primary country to circumvent these sanctions by, having Russian goods and again trade through Russia being directed through Serbia. And I can only imagine that probably is the case right now, and that will probably continue to be the case, and that once again Serbia will be under the microscope, that they will face the ire that, say, a Russia or a Hungary does in the near future if this continues to go on.
Yeah, and I think that's why Serbia is working with Hungary, because it will make it more difficult for the West to do that, to isolate
Yes.
it. Orban is being particularly wise here. He's always been a smarter leader than any leader that the Poles have. We've brought him up before. For instance, he never got rid of his country's currency for the EU dollar. So he's much more difficult of a figure to manipulate. He paid off all of the country's debts by 2008. Whereas one of the interesting things that Duda said at Davos, uh, he he was very much a realist about the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and I think this is partly why he's so kind of gleeful and excited and ambitious right now. After saying that, he didn't think Russia would do more than just go into Donbass, he said the reason for that was Russia only had, according to our intelligence, about 160 to 190,000. And this was not enough to take Kiev, and let alone Odessa. He mentioned that Ukraine is more than twice the size of Poland. And he reasoned that this was going to be quite a different kind of operation. It was not going to be a full-scale war in the kind that maybe they had originally imagined could take place some time in the future. But as the scene was developing, they noticed that the amount of troops that Russia had amassed was not enough. So I think what Duda is thinking is Russia doesn't have the big ambitions that the West claims that they do. And he sees this as an opportunity to go in, that it's now or never. Poland may never get another chance like this. Hungary, on the other hand, landlocked, smaller economy, I think also eminently more wise, is saying, and it's not just because Orban has closer relations with Putin, it's because he has to have closer relations with Putin, right? Um, he's thinking, if Poland goes in, this is my guess, if Poland goes in, Russia may decide to mobilize, right? The force that Russia has in Ukraine now is no more than 10% of its entire total force that it has spread out all across Russia. It's many of the units aren't even elite units. Now, I know they've started including the Su-57. They have started including the Terminator, which is their top of the line mobile fighting vehicle. It can carry, I think, between 5 to 7 guys. The important thing is it has not one, but two 30-millimeter cannons. And it has much, much more superior protection than something like a BMP with a retrofitted turret on it, like a modern turret. So Orban, I think, is rightly afraid that either Russia is going to mobilize, and this could spread into a much larger war because of Poland, or let's say it just drags on in a semi-frozen conflict, and the sanctions stay on. Long term, he, I think, rightly sees that this is not something his country can weather very well. And I don't even think it's about him wanting to remain in power, and that's the only reason why. I do think there is a genuine concern here. I know there's corruption. I get it. They're all corrupt. I know all these arguments, but I think there is a genuine concern, because if, as I mentioned earlier, if you map out chronologically all the things that he's done for the last 15, 20 years, for Hungary to have the kind of power to make independent decisions as much as it does for such a small country, it could not have been done with the kind of without the kind of decisions that Orban had made.
Oh, absolutely not. It would just be another Poland at that case, and it would be put in the exact same position, and it would be just one of these other, uh, let's just say, occasionally renegade but very easily manageable states where you'll notice whenever these EU crackdowns happen, they've always been much harsher on Hungary for a very obvious reason, and we're starting to see that play out. And I mean, even going back to Orban's speeches, not to sing the praises of one man too much, but he has to be one of the smartest politicians in the world today. And maybe it's not so much intelligence, but one of the, let's just say, has his finger on the pulse the most out of anyone. Where you'll recall it was actually a speech commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon, which was the treaty that was signed after World War I with the Kingdom of Hungary independent from Austria. That saw the ceding of two-thirds of the territory to new nations or already existing nations, such as giving Transylvania to Romania, which I'm not going to complain about that one, but that's aside the point. But with that being said, he came out and talked about in that speech about uh, building new blocks and more or less, charting the course of our civilization in the future. More or less, giving a foundational speech for a new civilization block, as it is talking about how Hungary is willing to cooperate with its neighbors and it is willing to work towards a more integrated future. And once again, now maybe at the time he was talking more about the Visegrad countries, but that seems to be applied to these other countries we've discussed right now. This new coalition he seems to be building with Croatia, Croatia, Slovakia, Serbia, etc., where it is just this new block of nations that is within the European Union, at least most of them are within the European Union, but has a degree of independence and will not just be a bulwark against the European Union's purported chief rival at that point, which would be Russia at the time, and is much harder to dislodge than say the Polish government. Because I could see when push comes to shove, or like in a Polish election year, I know that Duda and the Law and Justice Party did weather the past storm, but if the European Union really needed to, if it was a matter of the survival of the bloc, they would have a way to dislodge Duda and dislodge the Law and Justice and dislodge the current regime within Poland. I'm not saying they couldn't do the same to Hungary, but I think Hungary has a lot more safeguards than Poland does at this point. And you could just compare the way the two different countries have approached their nationalism day in and day out. But point being is, you have one that has decided if we just pay our tribute, whether that be in the form of aggression toward an aggressive attitude towards Russia and wanting to be that bulwark or uh, whatever else, we can do what we want. We can be our own little nationalistic state. But you have Hungary, who you have Orban out there giving speeches charting the new course of what the next century will look like for Hungary. And the difference is just remarkable at that rate.
Right. Now, what Poland has up its sleeve is not very different than what Ukraine has up its sleeve in terms of being able to persuade the West. The West knows that the more bellicose Poland becomes towards Russia, the less that the EU can demand on it to uh, let's say battle Poland on its own territory in a culture war. The issue, say for instance, of the judges and so on, right? The EU is in no position right now to ask anything from Poland, and the more aggressive Poland is, the less likely that they can impose sanctions on them. Now, I do believe some sanctions have already been placed on Hungary. Um, the advantage I see that Hungary is looking for, like you say, is a port, right? Um, I would not be surprised if Turkey would be a sure bet for trade to go up the Adriatic. So it would go in this loop from Turkey, it would go across the Aegean, the Mediterranean, up the Adriatic into Croatia, and you could have this crescent shape from Slovakia going to the Adriatic down across the Mediterranean into Turkey for trade. Italy, um, I think there's a suspicion that Italy could crack if things keep going this way, right? Economically, trying to sustain Italy would be like Greece. It would be
Oh,
very difficult because
yes.
of the massive amount of debt, right? Things could turn very quickly there, right?
And I mean, they're already infamous for their unstable governments, unstable governments, I should say.
Yeah.
I believe over, and I think we're reaching the point where it's actually 70 since the end of World War II, since the overthrow of Mussolini and the implementation of a post-war regime, that their parliamentary republics have had 70 different administrations go through the halls of power at this point, and including most
Hmm.
recently the dislodging of the coalition. I believe it was either in I think it was May 2019, about 3 years ago, when Salvini's coalition got dislodged, and then you had Conte's government fall apart, or now you have Luigi Draghi, who I think is also part of the Five Star Movement at this point, and you have that now, and already you have a lot of protests during the COVID stuff. You had a lot of them take to the streets all across the country, whether that be north, central, south, and again, I'm not saying it's too regionalized, but compared to most European countries, most Western European countries, especially, Italy is remarkably regionalized in that sense. And then you had recently anti-NATO protests going on, I believe, in I think it was Milan, where you had this pretty big anti-NATO demonstration, things that like we're not dying for Biden, stuff like that coming out there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean, it's infamously a very politically unstable country as far as Western countries go. And then economically, it's a basket case, as you said. They've had to buoy it up to prevent it. I'm to prevent it from Greece because they saw what happens when you let a European Union economy that operates on the euro collapse. It becomes the black hole that is Greece, and they don't want that in a nation that is, at least population-wise and obviously geography-wise, much larger than Greece, and still holds the title, I think, after the British have left, as the third largest economy within the European Union at this point.
Hmm.
And so they are technically one of the major players, as disheveled as they may be when it comes to their economic and political state. They do resemble much more that of a Eastern European or Balkan nation in that regard. I will give them that much, and that comes with its pros and cons, I suppose. But speaking of Italy, you did have, despite all of that with their government, they did propose a peace plan because I do think you touched on that point that they don't want to
Yeah. That,
witness.
that 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 is what I was alluding to.
Yes, that they don't want to witness the economic implosion for some Western project. So this peace plan, and this was just the high offer, so it would call for a ceasefire and demilitarization of the front lines naturally. It would encompass Ukraine being a neutral country within Europe with its security guaranteed by a not yet identified group of countries. Now, the third, which I think is probably the most outlandish expectation, and again, I'll get into some of the points and what I think will happen here, would be a bilateral agreement between Russia and Ukraine to clarify the future of Crimea and Donbass, which would involve them returning to Ukraine but having maximum autonomy. So they'd be asking Russia to give up not only the Donbass but also Crimea, which it's held on for the past 8 years. And then the fourth would be a multilateral peace agreement between the European Union and Russia that would include a staged withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and winding down of Western sanctions against Moscow. So it's the most sane plan that has been put out of the West. I think the most absurd demand and the most absurd point on that would probably be point three, which asks them to abandon Crimea and the Donbass. Now, maybe if you propose this plan before the invasion, having Russia cut off the Donbass in terms of a maximum autonomy as part of the peace agreement, that would have been far more likely. I'm not saying that would have been likely at all, but it would have been far more likely. But after Russia has put so much blood and money into this,
No
they're not
way.
they're not going to dislodge this, or even something like Kherson, where they've introduced the ruble, or at least plan to introduce the ruble
Oh
within
no,
the.
it's introduced.
Oh, I okay, so it's been fully introduced. So where they've introduced that, so again, with this territory that they have obtained through outright conquest at this point, they're not going to get them to dislodge. Now, of course, this is an initial peace plan that was presented to the European Union. And the way these things always work is they never resemble what the final product is. And there may be a point or two or part of a point or two left by the time you actually get to a final agreement, assuming this is even allowed to reach negotiation. But point being is, as I was telling you, despite some of the more ridiculous points there, like point three, it is still the most coherent thing that the West has put out since, I would say, since 2014 at the least.
Yeah, and it will never fly. But I would say there's a couple of things. I took a look at a map of the most fertile regions of Ukraine for corn, soy, wheat, and barley. Um, the Kherson region is, I mean, Ukraine is blessed with like this incredibly fertile soil. And there's many regions that can grow all those crops very well. But one of the consistent regions with like the highest yields was Kherson. Now, I forget exactly whether it was um, barley or soy, but there were two of those four that it grew exceptionally well, right? This territory, of course, extends all the way into Russia up until the Caspian, but then it gets a little bit dry. And it's interesting because Russia, even technically outside of Ukraine, is still the largest or second largest grain exporter in the world for several years now. But can you imagine with Kherson how much more yield they would get, right? Um, I think the other thing is um, you're looking at two different people. This really is a brother war, and both of them, I think, are fighting for representing, who is the authentic and legitimate Eastern Slavic country. Um, Ukraine will never feel safe until like Russia is greatly diminished or destroyed, and Russia will never feel like it's safe until like NATO is out of that area, doesn't have an influence, or Ukraine for decades will not be able to make any kind of threat.
Yeah, so we've discussed the dynamics between Russia and Ukraine when it comes to, as you said, this really is one of the core components of this war is to determine, who are the real Rus. Now, I know we've gone into this how
Yeah,
a lot of Ukrainian groups, especially like the more pro-Azov, the more hard right groups, have tried to distance themselves from the East Slavic identity and start to adopt like maybe these Nordic symbology or Germanic symbology in order to try to distance themselves from that. But I would say fundamentally the core claim of Ukrainian nationalism among most Ukrainians is still that we are the real Rus and that the Muscovites are the pretenders. And
right.
conversely, the Russians would say we are the real Rus and the so-called Ukrainians are the pretenders. And really, I think you're right that Ukraine will not rest until Russia is at least what it was in the 90s, if not outright fractured.
Yeah,
And Russia will always feel, I mean, of course, it will feel the pressure of NATO on its border with the Baltic states, with even countries like Romania, with Turkey, and maybe even Finland going forward. But none of those will be the civilizational threat that Ukraine will be. Well, number one, just looking at the geography of it, with that launch pad for a potential attack into Russia, but with the West legitimizing this state that claims to be the true Rus. And I think fundamentally that just even beyond pragmatic reasons, which I'm not saying those don't play a role at all, those certainly play a role. But I think when it comes down to the core of it, they cannot rest while this pretender is still there, whether Ukraine remain an independent entity under Russian influence or whether it's fully integrated back into Russia, or at least the key components of Ukraine are implemented back into Russia. But I do think, just from a civilizational standpoint, talking long term throughout the rest of the century, and I don't know what the outcome of this war is going to be. So long as there is an independent state called Ukraine with Kiev as its capital, Russia will always be uneasy.
right. In some ways, the reasoning that let's say Kiev gives It's a bit mixed, on the one hand, it sees itself as part of Europe, which is an idea that's more common with Poland. But it also sees itself as, the legitimate Eastern Slavic people. Everyone else is not legitimate. Um, this, but by aligning itself with Europe, what it's doing, it's a pseudo-metamorphosis, which is the false identity. And that isn't to say Russia doesn't have one. Most countries do. But I'll get to Russia. And so what it's doing by allowing itself to be dominated by America, even if it's only doing it pragmatically for a short period of time, it will lose. It cannot withstand it on its own. Um, it is projecting itself in a pseudo metamorphosis far, far ahead in civilizational development, right? Um, that early period is now ramping up to like more of a late stage civilization where, because of its integration with the West, the West's entire framing is ahistorical, it is atheist or non-religious, it is decadent. It has all those features of a late stage civilization. Russia, on the other hand, of course, had its own pseudo metamorphosis. Part of that was communism. Um, it is still working that out. Uh, the the period with Peter the Great. But what I would argue is it is developing from its springtime onward, where in a way Kiev is not. It to me, it sounds kind of like in the Balkans, we'll talk about, historically we did this, historically we did that. But none of us have the power to project a destiny into the future. Our destiny is to just survive, right? Russia is not there. Russia isn't there. I mean, yes, it's fighting a war for its survival, but it has an extra component to its idea of itself and what its destiny is that is much greater, right? So it's progressing along the development of a civilization in a way that is not skipping over certain epochs because it's so drawn within the West, if that makes sense for people, right? I don't know if people understand what I'm
Yeah,
what I'm getting.
I know what you're getting at, so that means probably our fine audience would understand what you are getting at with that. But I mean, I really can't add anything uh, more to that. But I would say that once again, doing another show like this, looking at all the other news, not to downplay the significance of the boots on the ground conflict. Once again, all the stories coming out of this are from outside of the battlefield, whether they be from Hungary, whether they be from Poland, whether they be from Italy, whether they be from the West, or or you know, whether that be America, UK, France, etc., where it's once again the power players of the world deciding this. Now, I do have a little bit of news about some of Biden's comments vis-a-vis China. If
Mm.
you have nothing else on this that you would like to
No,
add,
I'm yeah. Let's move on to Biden. Definitely,
so to quote my dear mother once again, our Dick Clark half-dead president had come out and said,
that's really good.
yeah, yes, I'm very proud of that one. Yeah, she said that in the context that one of her afternoon shows got interrupted by a breaking news story. But with that little bit of family trivia out of the way, Biden had come out and said that the United States would be willing to use military force to defend Taiwan from any Chinese aggression. So you have this real ratcheting up of rhetoric from the Biden administration. Now, many people expected, and even arguably myself, that there would be something of a reconciliation with China due to Biden's previous record. Now, I do think that was probably the initial goal to try to revive that Chimerica system, but to his credit, or at least what Trump's spurred on, I believe that was broken. You recall that Xi Jinping, throughout the past, I would say, 5 years or so, ever since 2017, has been making internal moves within the politics of China in general and the CCP in particular, the Chinese Communist Party, to remove or sideline figures who have descended towards him, and even the more pro-Western figures. You'll recall with one of the most recent lockdowns that took place in Shanghai, and a lot of the speculation behind that was it was an internal political move to strike a blow at the more pro-Western or pro-cooperation with America faction that is based primarily out of Shanghai. You recall within 2017, he purged a lot of the ranks of the party, and I don't think he outright pursued criminal charges against them, but he removed them from positions of power. And then within that same time frame, he also removed the term limits for head of the party, which also, ever since the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the head of the party has always been simultaneously the president of China. So more or less, he's removed term limits for how long he can be president of China. And even you recall that Trump made the president for life. I like the sound of that, but to get off the Trump stuff at least for now. So you've had those internal political works into China, which I do believe has led the Western talking heads to think, and the Western strategists to think, that reconciliation with China is not possible. And you've seen this gradual ramping up of rhetoric out of Washington when it comes to the Chinese question, that people who were previously, I wouldn't call them Sinophiles, but people who were, let's just say, benefiting greatly from the American-Chinese relationship have seem to have turned on a dime and are now some of the biggest China hawks you will hear from. And they're talking about the integrity of Taiwan, how we have to stand with Hong Kong, or we need to increase our security cooperation with Japan, South Korea, etc., where they are trying to revitalize that so-called Obama pivot to Asia and really come in strong against China, conduct these drills in South China Sea. Now, a lot of this did start under Trump, but point being is, on top of the current crisis where we're supposed to be taking the hard line against Russia, you already have Biden making at least an informal military commitment to Taiwan that we will stand with them in the event of a Chinese invasion, which a lot of people have speculated, ourselves included, that while it may not, while it probably isn't likely, the likelihood has increased drastically of a Chinese action against Taiwan in the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And like I said last episode, the trifecta would be Russia-Ukraine, China-Taiwan, and Iran-Israel. That, like, all those three crises happening simultaneously would put the American empire to its limit, to the point where it would either, as an imperial power, collapse under its own weight, or the nukes would fly. And that's really, I would say, a coin toss chance of which would happen first. So, and we discussed the possibility of tactical nuclear strikes being a being a weapon in the future, and the actual possibility of nuclear warfare, even just on a small scale, being something we could look, well, not necessarily look forward to, but look out for, I suppose, would be more appropriate to say in that context. But you have, after, and once again, just to preempt people, you could talk about the suboptimal Russian performance. Point being is, even if we believe the worst Russian projections, they are still, in a way, winning this war, even if you want to consider it a Pyrrhic victory. So, and once again, to clarify, I personally wouldn't. But you have Russia-Ukraine right now, and then that's supposedly the biggest threat. You have Biden committing, saying, we're willing to fight a two-front war. Now, he didn't outright say that, but that's what the statement implied. And of course, we all know politics about, well, what's the deeper meaning of that statement, what are they actually trying to convey. But it's this level of hubris. I'm sure they know, maybe not even hubris, because I'm sure they know they can't actually enforce this, but it's this massive bluff saying that we're willing to fight, once again, like we did in the 1940s, a two-continent war in order to reassert or further assert our global hegemony. And that's the promise coming out of DC right now. Now, fortunately, no orders have been signed, no bills have been passed through Congress that would solidify any of this. But you have the commander-in-chief, the guy in the bully pulpit, as it's historically been called, and the so-called leader of the free world, I suppose we could say, coming out and saying, well, yeah, we're willing to do this, and you can look forward to that. So it's just this. I think it encapsulates the late American Empire better than almost anything I can have. And this is less than a year out from the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I don't put particular blame on Biden for. As I said when the withdrawal was happening, I think after this point, with the way everything had turned out, whether that would have been Trump, Biden, or anyone else, that a disastrous withdrawal was inevitable. Now, I do think there were particular things he did, like the abandoning of Bagram, that made it much worse than it should have been. But point being is there was no clean way to get out of Afghanistan. But it's just still with the massive optical and PR defeat that the Afghan withdrawal was. Not only have we increased our posturing against Russia with unmitigated support to Ukraine, we are now making yet another commitment to Taiwan that, hey, the same military apparatus that botched its withdrawal is going to defend you from one of the world's largest militaries. And again, the trifecta will be when we make some guarantee to Israel. Now, of course, we don't have a formal security guarantee to Israel, and I don't think that's coming anytime soon. In fact, sentiments within the U.S. seem to point towards the opposite. But point being is, once again, you get that crisis in the Middle East. It's the trifecta when you have to deal with all three of those, and there's just something so rich that I really can't put into proper words about these threats being made in light of being less than a year out from one of the worst military blunders in modern American history.
Yes, and to that, I would add like I would add the flip side to that. As we're talking about this very strong union between Russia and China, you've explained what lengths America has to do to try to split it up, or at least tackle it partially with several fronts, but at least two. And on the flip side of that is Russia finally maybe getting a break. Um, Russia has been fighting with some help in Syria, but it's mostly them and the Syrians. But Hezbollah and Iran, of course, are there. They play important roles. Their roles are not as big, but they're important nonetheless. Um, but Russia is essentially alone in Ukraine. In fact, any conflict, Russia is always going to fight alone. By by America focusing on China and Taiwan, I personally don't believe that America is going to get into a war with China proper. I think what America wants is China to attack Taiwan similarly and get a really bad bloody nose. Um, I could be wrong, but I think that would be the maybe the first expectation that they would have. That would be an ideal expectation. How well would that work protracted over time? I don't know. But what it would do is it would give Russia a break to some degree. And that maybe is perhaps why Poland feels it's necessary to intervene. Because, you know, just the tone of the news, the kind of headlines that you're seeing is Europe wants this to end. They are terrified of whether they'll have enough energy left for the winter. Um, Russia has now an 8% increase in exports, according to The Economist. Um, so financially, economically, it's surviving this very well, better than just about any European country. Um, I don't think China wants to necessarily invade Taiwan, but I think what America wants to do is create a scenario where it will have to. Russia could not back off from its obligations, let's say, to Donbass and Crimea. America always knew that it could draw Russia into Ukraine, despite how much Russia resisted that, that it was inevitable if enough pressure was placed on those sensitive areas. I think that's what America wants for Taiwan. They want to shepherd China into a position where they cannot not invade Taiwan. But I mean, the Chinese, they're highly intelligent and clever people. You look at, I forget the name of the guy who wrote that book back in the 90s. That essentially he not only rejected American liberalism, but he uh, warned China not to go down this path, to use its relationship with America, but to never change culturally, right? Because there's that Badu said, "Of course, we'll tolerate everything that you are, as long as you become like us." You know, that's been the attitude of the West for quite a while. So um, the flip side is this could give Russia some breathing room, because it would stretch America's abilities. It would have to start funding Taiwan, and that would have a very different outcome, I think, in Europe, because the manufacturing capacity in Europe is so low, and its economy and inflation is rising so high that I don't think it can do it. And but we will see. We will see.
And that's all I had for this right here. If you have any additional stories of which we had forgotten, now would be the time, of course. But that's all I have for
No,
this
that's all I have as well.
installment. And it's been, let's see, today we're recording. It is Tuesday, May 24th, 2022. The premiere will, of course, be on Wednesday, May 25th, 2022. And just judging by our last recording date, which was Thursday and Friday, it's been about 4 or 5 days since we last recorded, and we had enough for another full episode. So things are moving pretty rapidly. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.